Hey, howdy, and welcome everybody to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology, and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. It is July 18th, Monday, July 18th through the 24th, coming at you for this third week of a bumpy month. It's actually an in-between week. It's a very interesting week in that regard that we're coming out of a wampum full moon last week and a new moon next week. This week is sort of about just all the couple of gear shifts. But man, that full moon, holy moly, Zoe. How did last week go for you? Because, man, that was some deep feels.
Yeah. I mean, I felt it. That's for sure.
Yeah.
It was quite a week in my world,
Yeah. Lots of change, lots of movement in the below, as I like to say, with a full moon conjunct Pluto. And we're really moving through a big gear shift this week because it's a week where both the sun and Mercury are going to change signs. There's a kind of a follow-up to the full moon. That's kind of why I asked with the sun.
Oh,
and
interesting.
Pluto. Yeah.
I'm curious about what that means.
Right. Let's take a dive in. Let's see what the week has to offer. So as weeks go, it's an energetic in-between sort of week because there isn't anything major happening that sort of drives the energetic rhythm, right? Last week, the full moon drove the energetic rhythm of last week, and next week, the new moon in Leo will sort of be the dominant big pillar of energy that we're working with. So we are in this in-between week. But part of what's making July an interesting month is personal planets changing signs. And this is a week that both Mercury and the sun will cross out from the Cancer mansion into the Leo mansion. So how we start this week off, like today's energy, and how we will finish it at the end of the week is going to be radically different. And we're really going from a lot of water to a lot of fire. Water implies deeply emotional. Fire implies movement, action, and change. And so it's a really dynamically interesting week with a little bit of leftover depth and gravitas from the full moon, while we're also sort of gear shifting and moving into a different sensation by the end of the week.
I think I'm really ready for the fiery. I've felt my feels. They have been here.
They have
know
been
what
here.
I mean?
Yes, sweetheart, I do, I
okay,
do.
girlfriend, let's put this into action.
All right, so let's actually just start with today. The energy here on Monday is very, very watery and deeply spiritual. Mercury and the sun are still very close to each other because last week, if you tuned into last week's podcast, we talked about Mercury and the sun coming together, the superior conjunction, where we get a little bit of guidance and awareness of what to do next. So Mercury and the sun are still close together, and both of them are trining Neptune today. Neptune is our spiritual connection. Sun and Mercury both trining Neptune means the ease of connection into feeling supported by spirit is vast and deep over the weekend and into today. But by the same token, we get to that deep spiritual connection through the feeling mechanisms of our human body. Emotions are waves of energy that if we resist them or crumble underneath them, we can't actually rise up to our integrated potential. Our integrated selves have to allow for feelings to be part of the experience. The challenge isn't the feelings so much as what our minds do about the feelings So we have a thought that inspires a feeling, then we grab on to the thought and wrestle with it, and we keep the feeling machine going. So as we move through these couple of days, two things are possible. One is to get so pummeled by your feeling experience that you go through a little bit of emotional overwhelm. And what's available in that as well, though, is to somehow find the spiritual comfort that says, though my emotions are taking me for a ride, that my sense of the bigger picture is that I got this. These emotions and feelings will pass, and I don't want to bypass them while they're here. I don't want to wrestle with them to try to, like, air quotes, figure them out, but lean into the idea of surrender to an experience that is ultimately designed to pass right through you like a wave of energy. It's
Hmm.
when we grab the feeling and say to ourselves, why am I feeling this way? I shouldn't feel this. This is painful. And then we wind up getting stuck in the old feeling pattern a little bit longer because we're arguing with like life on life's terms. So as we move through like yesterday, today, and early tomorrow, it's a marvelous opportunity to just say, well, okay, how am I relating to these deep feels? And can I accept the day to day experience of my emotional body's information that it's offering me? Find the nuggets of wisdom that are in the feelings, but not get so grabbed by them that we believe everything that we think and feel and forget that this is just a moment that's gonna pass.
Hmm.
I think you'll love this, though, because tomorrow is the day that Mercury, our perception mechanism, is moving out of the very tender, vulnerable, emotional sign of Cancer and into the fires of Leo. So
Okay.
for the next yeah, no, we get our roar back if you'll forgive the sort of Leo pun. How we communicate and process our perceptions is governed by the sign that Mercury is in. So for the last 2.5 weeks with Mercury in Cancer, everything about how we're perceiving our world was through the lens of how does this make me feel? And that's what the Cancer Mansion is designed for. And that's so there's valuable, it's valuable to go into those spaces so that we can, figure out how to live with our vulnerability and not try to squeeze it down.
Hmm.
But it will be more comfortable in all of our negotiations, our thought processes, with the planet that governs how we think, communicate, and process and perceive in the fiery sign of Leo, where leadership rises up and creative expression is primary. And I think that we get more focused on our outsides and what we want to create with Mercury in Leo than we are on the insides and how tender we feel and how we're not ready to create because we got to attend to our like little vulnerable spaces. So we will feel this shift and change, which will then at the end of the week sort of get even more fiery when the sun follows suit and we move into the Leo mansion at the end of the week.
Hmm.
But meantime, understand that communication for the next 2.5 weeks is going to be focused on what you're trying to bring to the world as a creative expression. You're more likely to have some sense of power and authority in your voice. And we're still in that portion of Mercury's cycle that I call the free and clear bit, where there's no retrograde in sight. He's going to move all the way through this sign without threatening to come backwards and have us, have to bump into the furniture and review things. So it's a great couple of weeks for planning and putting into action some of the creative expressions that that are vibing in your heart. It's a great time to get your voice out into the world as the next 2.5 weeks unfold. Now, tomorrow's going to be an interesting day because we've got this planetary ingress, and that's always a little interesting when a personal planet is changing signs. We will feel that and respond to it, even if it's not something that we're conscious of. So that makes the day sort of just interesting for communication. We sort of wake up in the morning and we're communicating in one way, but by the time we put our heads on the pillow, it's a whole different landscape.
Hmm.
While that's going on, the sun and Pluto oppose each other. This is what I was referring to. So, when I talked about that, there's a reminder of the intensity of the full moon experience of last week, because we talked about that full moon as being conjunct Pluto, right? So, Pluto is at 27 degrees of Capricorn right now, and that full moon was at 21 degrees of Capricorn.
Right,
So
right.
that had the sun at 21 degrees of Cancer. The exact opposition point for that would be 21 degrees of Capricorn. That's 6 degrees away from where Pluto was. That's close enough to be what we call conjunct, meaning the Lord of the Underworld, the death and rebirth planet, was fully activated as part of last week's full moon. But the sun has moved 6 degrees since the full moon. And now the sun is opposite Pluto, which was hinted at last Wednesday in the full moon, and peaks today. This is our conscious awareness available to be able to perceive things that are in the below, that are part of our shadow material, that express power and authority struggles that may have been a little bit hidden from our conscious view, even last week when the full moon was helping us release unconscious material. What's happening this week, as the sun opposes Pluto tomorrow, we might become more aware of the power struggle that we're letting go of. That's something that was present in our felt experience last week, like deaths that were happening, might become experiences this week that are more revealing of power struggles, unconscious material, things from the below. Certainly, any time that the sun and Pluto oppose each other, we're getting an opportunity to see our shadow, not because it's not there and we like, oh, no shadow, I get to see what's under there. It's like, think about it. The sun is coming from the opposite side of the sky, hitting Pluto from across the room, if you will. So the shadow is long when that happens. Just think of the late day sun creates long shadows. So this is a late day sun moment casting shadow that's very long. And when the shadow is long, you can go, look, there's my shadow. So considering that we're still sort of vibing in a lunar cycle where we got kicked off into a Cancer cycle with a new moon conjunct Black Moon Lilith, that was a promise that we were going to be looking at some deep
Right,
shadow
right.
material as we move through this lunar
Yeah.
cycle. Then you have a full moon conjunct the Lord of the Underworld, planet of death and rebirth, kicked off by a new moon with Black Moon Lilith in tow. Really made this a deep release last week from a profound unconscious place. And because the sun is opposing Pluto now, it's kind of like the sequel, if you will. Last week's movie release was What's Dying to Be Reborn. And this week is the sequel, in case you didn't catch everything that needed your attention in terms of death and birth, rebirth and release. We have an opportunity in these first 3 days of this week to be reminded of stuff in the underworld of your life that might still need a little bit of help to die off so that something new can be reborn. On Thursday of this week, we've got a little bump up between Jupiter and Saturn. The geometry between them is a semi-square, like quite literally half a square. So if squares are conflicts and obstacles, then a semi-square is in the same camp, but milder. It's a semi-square. Not as bumpy as a full-on square. Full-on squares means something needs your attention. It's a conflict, an obstacle, a stepping stone. It is an undeniable fight that never gets resolved, and that gets our attention. That's what a full square between any
Right.
two bodies are. I always go to the wall and the floor, right? They are arguing. One says stand up, the other says lie down, and thank God they argue because then we get houses and
Right.
buildings and rooms. Because without them, the floor and the wall don't stay fast to their perspective. The structure falls apart. So squares represent conflicts and difficult experiences we have to move through, but they lead to the most growth that we could possibly imagine. We learn as we grow, and we grow as we learn. So a semi-square is just half that intensity. So something we will feel energetically, but not something that's going to throw us to the curb. Jupiter is about expansion, Saturn is about restriction. In terms of them both being the social planets, they reflect what's happening outside of your house. Like the outer planets are what's happening outside of Earth, the sort of higher dimensional consciousness, and Jupiter and Saturn reflect all the stuff that's happening on the planet that isn't in your body and in your
Mhm.
home. So if Saturn is always reflecting our relationship to our responsibilities and the things we have to do. And Jupiter is holding in our consciousness the things that are joyful, expansive, and that we get to do. When these two planets are in conflict with each other, we're in conflict around the have tos and the get tos. There will be a lack of balance this whole week for everybody in terms of trying to put together the goals that we have and the responsibilities that we might have to tend to that keep us from having the joyful expansions that we desire. On Thursday this week, there's a bit of a dust up between Jupiter and Saturn that's going to color the entire week. The geometry that they're going to make is a 45-degree angle. Semi-square, half the juice, if you will. Squares are about deep conflicts that can't relinquish their side of the fight, and that's on purpose, right? The floor and the wall is my classic sort of example. That the floor is saying lay down, the wall is saying stand up, and they're in this intense argument that never ends. And thank God, because that's what creates structure and solidity, right? So the floor and the wall are learning a lesson about holding their tension of opposites, and the net result is the room stands because the fight has been worked with well. So in a semi-square, it's half that energy of conflict. And when it's Jupiter and Saturn doing this, it's about responsibility and reward and how they relate to each other. Saturn is all about the responsibility, discipline, steadfastness. I have to do this. Jupiter's all about the joys and expansions that life has to offer. We don't get to do one over the other. We're always having to do both. Sometimes while we're sort of exploring the what I have to do and what I get to experience, there are moments where those ideas are at odds with each other, and this week features that. Not a major bump of a full-on square where things would break down and stop and explode because of the conflict between responsibility and expansion. But none of us will escape this week the idea that balancing between what you must attend to and what you wish you could attend to will be a little bit off. Because it peaks on Thursday, it's sort of right in the middle of this week, and we tend to think in weekly consciousness. I mean, the solar system doesn't know from the weeks of the year, but we do. So this week is marked. And in fact, this is the only major transit of the week. So it is a definite energy that all of us will feel. So in how to perceive the week to come, just understand that if you approach your list of responsibilities with a little bit of discipline and willingness, then the joyful expansions you seek will be there. You just might not get to choose one over the other. In other words, there will be consequences if you let go of your responsibilities and your disciplines this week. And yet there will be that temptation of saying, I don't want to. Can't I just sit on the couch and eat bonbons. And Saturn is like, no, you can't. All right, so you want fire? We got some fire for you. We're moving into the Leo mansion on Friday. Leo is the mansion ruled by the sun. In fact, if you look at Western astrology and how certain archetypes rose up in prominence, I think it's interesting that in the Northern Hemisphere, summertime is when the sun is out and shining bright, and we're all having our summer fun experience. And so the archetype of Leo rose up to represent that sort of joyful, dancey moment where we get to enjoy the time that isn't the harvest that's about to come in the fall or the planting in spring. So summertime is when we get to play in between the moments in our agrarian consciousness. This is what we come out of, as of a couple of thousand years ago, where we get to enjoy the full light of consciousness, the longest days, and the joy that can come when we get to focus on things that aren't the planting and the reaping. Now, of course, we don't live in an agrarian world anymore. We're all in, the go, 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 go consciousness of a modern landscape. But still now we have the archetype of the Leo mansion as being the time when we are in consideration of all of the ways that personal creativity generates a life of joy. Leo invented all of the things that are beautiful and fun about life. That's why he's the archetype that rules children and sex and artistic expression. So as we move through the Leo mansion, our consciousness is focused on all of the ways that we as individuals contribute what's inside of us into the world in a creative and expansive way. I certainly think, as we spoke about at the top of the podcast episode, Zoe, that we're all going to welcome a little bit of fire because I think the Cancer Mansion this particular year was so tender and emotional because of the landscape that we're moving through with the other sort of planetary setups for the year. So I think at the very least, the shift in our solar consciousness out of the Cancer mansion and into the Leo mansion is something that's going to be helpful to people who are finding that the vulnerability that this time frame is generating to be overwhelming. So, listen, the sun moving into Leo is not going to fix your tender heart. It's not going to take away your sensitivity or your vulnerability. But it is a shift that the system is going to experience. And I invite you guys, if you are listening to this podcast and your story has been that the feels have been rising up in a somewhat overwhelming manner, I think that by the time we get fully ensconced into the Leo mansion, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and into next week, we will all feel a little bit warmer, a little bit more on fire to express out in the world, and a little less tender and vulnerable. All right, so we still have another week of July left next week, and that's where the most intense energy of the month is hitting, which is this Uranus North Node conjunction that I've talked a little bit before. Mars is going to be there too. You definitely want to tune into next week's podcast to talk about this last week in July that's going to be much bumpier than this week. So we're in the quietest week of the month, but trust me, it's not going to feel quiet at all because we're still engaged in some deep changes and transformations courtesy of the sun and Pluto. And Mars is inching his way towards North Node and Uranus as they come together at the end of the month. Tune in next week, kids. You do not want to miss that podcast. I'm going to talk all about Uranus and the North Node. In the meantime, get through the week and have at it, everybody.
It's dream segment time. Every week, Dr. Michael will interpret dreams that are sent in via email or take a live caller. If you would like your dream interpreted on the podcast, you can go ahead and email us at dreams@michaellennox.com. Hopefully your dream will make it onto the show. We have a question from a dreamer this week, and Oren says, I personally have very vivid, sometimes nightmarish dreams, and I often wake up the next day feeling exhausted. I'd like to know whether nightmares can make you more tired the next day and what we can learn about ourselves by analyzing our reoccurring dreams. And if you have any other insights on this subject, I'd love to hear that too. Thank you so much for your time.
You know, the brain is an interesting thing. There's a lot of research that shows us that there's not a lot of distinction in terms of our brain's experience of perceiving our world around us between something that we would call real and not real. Here's one example. People get better at a skill just by visualizing themselves performing that skill successfully. That's fascinating to me. That means the body is responding to something that the brain is generating just as a perception experience and not necessarily as an actual physical experience.
That's like in music, you can read the music and visualize yourself playing it if you're not able to practice with your instrument, and it helps you.
And the research bears that out. This is not an idea, it's a fact. We have measured this in studies. There's tons of literature around this power of the brain and perception to have an impact on the body's experience. So another thing I'll just sort of throw onto the table as we're inching towards answering this question. When we feel tired, we usually think of that as a body experience. We say, oh, I'm tired and I need rest. And rest then restores our bodies. So the illusion there is that what's tired is your physical body and that the rest of sleep is restorative because your physical body got to chill out for a couple hours. That ain't how it works, kids. Your body, our bodies are magnificent machines. Now, they will eventually and do eventually break down because of the phenomena of time. And for whatever reason, this is how this works. And we start out in a body that's vibrant and slowly gets less vibrant as we inch towards our death. But the experience of tiredness is not a body experience, though that's where the sensation of tiredness is signaled to us. It's the brain that needs rest. It's the brain clearing out metabolic waste that allows us to wake up feeling restored. So we think and experience and talk and smell and taste and gather all this data up during the day. And our brain is filled with the impact of all of that perception. The brain is made out of cells, and those cells have to fire up and function. And as they use fuel to fire up and function, they also poop. Metabolic waste is generated by brain activity. The brain is not connected to the body's lymphatic system because of the blood-brain barrier. It's in a separate protected system. So the lymphatic system is busy all day long clearing out the metabolic waste from your body's cells, but the brain has to store all of that metabolic waste until we go into REM sleep. And part of what happens in REM is that there's this weird shrinking of brain cells and pushing of metabolic waste into the cerebral spinal fluid in between brain cells. And then when they squeeze back into their regular shape, that metabolic waste is pushed through the cerebral spinal fluid into the brain or, blood-brain barrier and taken away. And the brain wakes up refreshed. But get this. It's perception of this unreality that we call waking life that generates the metabolic waste that we have to clean out in sleep. In a very intense night of dreaming, especially in the nightmare realm, the brain is very activated. Our neofrontal cortex fires up. We're practically re-experiencing everything we experienced in our waking lives that day, because we're also reviewing material to figure out what needs to be kept as memory and what can be discarded because it's extraneous and unimportant. But this clearing out of the metabolic waste is kind of like not catching up enough if during the dream state, your frontal cortex is doing so much perceiving in the dream state that you're filling your brain up with metabolic waste just at the time that you're trying to clear it out through the mechanism that's in REM sleep. Now, listen, if a neuroscientist came in and heard me describe this, I would be decried for being like a mansplainer, talking about shit I don't really know. Because the truth is, I'm not a neuroscientist. I learned these things in grad school 20 years ago, and I remember just enough to be dangerous. So what I'm describing is not what I would call scientifically accurate, but it is absolutely good enough to explain that when we are overly active in our dream state, our brain is not as successful at clearing out the metabolic waste that's in there, and we wake up tired, feeling exhausted.
I was about to say I felt like I was in science class just now.
Well, yay! Listen, I love to teach. Now, what I just described would be the sort of neuroscience take on this exhaustion, right? That there is technical reasons for this experience of nightmares, heavy dreaming, resulting in waking up tired. But, like everything, there's a wonderful mystical side to understanding or at least perceiving these human experiences. And so there are two things that I want to say then about nightmares and this exhaustion that Oren is talking about and how we might perceive this from the more mystical perspective. There's a phenomenon that I refer to, and others too, I didn't make this up, but it's a woo-woo term. It's night school.
I haven't heard that one.
Okay. Well, my definition of night school is the notion that since we are multidimensional beings having a multidimensional experience that we cannot perceive because we are of this dimension, we are held by other dimensions that we cannot perceive, but we are no less multidimensional just because we can't perceive this. When we go into REM sleep, the dreaming state, that limiting perception mechanism of the thinking mind is asleep. And so we are more connected to our multidimensional self than when we are awake.
Right. Okay.
So I don't give a shit what the scientists will say about the brain function and therefore dreams have no meaning. It's like, oh, please, take that hubris elsewhere. So because this limiting mental perception experience is not interfering with our multidimensionality while we're in the dream state, I think it is possible, and most sort of new wave spiritual woo-woo folks, are in alignment with this, that when we are asleep, we are connecting to our multidimensional consciousness, getting downloads of higher wisdom from these other realms. Okay, let's put that on a shelf over here. And then over on the left side of the shelf, let's look at the idea that I do believe that our soul is very engaged by nightmares because they are very memorable moments where our deeper psyche is saying something's going on in the below that needs your attention. So our soul will throw up a very memorable dream, and it's likely going to be scary because I believe that nightmares help us expand into our full expression. And the only thing that limits us from expanding into our full expression is where we resist, where we say no. It's not like we have to learn how to expand. We don't. We just have to learn how to get out of the way of the expansion that's already wanting to happen. So if you've got a dream experience from the soulful perspective that says nightmares are going to rise up because your soul is knocking on your door, and that sleep itself can open you up to a multidimensional experience where your higher self is going to knock on your door, I think what Oren is talking about is the overwhelming experience that occurs when the dream state is opening us up to both powerful, unseeable, and knowable aspects of ourself, and then the unseeable and knowable aspects of our higher self that has its best access to us when we're asleep and dreaming.
Thank you for listening to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. You can find us on Apple Music, the iHeartRadio app, and anywhere you find your favorite shows. Head on over to michaellennox.com for information on astrology readings, the daily Astro Alert subscription, upcoming classes, and to join the mailing list.